The flames of bonfires, smoke saturated with human screams, and the metallic clang of torture instruments, this is how the journey began for those who were called witches or women corrupted against nature. The Inquisition, hiding behind sacred texts and papal bulls, created a whole world of pain in which the female body was seen not as a divine creation, but as an object for experimentation and humiliation. The stories preserved in interrogation, records, chronicles, and treatises on witchcraft paint a picture where the punishment for suspected lesbian relationships or sorcery was not simply death, but a long series of tortures that broke the body and extinguished consciousness. Officially, the purpose of torture was to obtain a confession, but the facts tell a different story. Interrogations turned into demonstration of power and sadistic reprisals. The lists of instruments stored in monastery basements and city prisons mention wooden wedges, primitive objects roughly carved from oak or beech, which were driven between the legs of women suspected of sinful intimacy. Their bodies were torn apart from within, and their screams became part of the sacred process. This method not only caused excruciating damage, but also served as a symbolic purification from the alleged unnatural sin. Officials and clergymen recorded this in the protocols as a test of truth. There are too many examples to speak of coincidence. The archives of the Inquisition court in Toulouse record that one woman accused of intercourse with the devil was subjected to a similar procedure and died of internal bleeding before the verdict was handed down. But death did not stop the process. The body was burned anyway, because in the eyes of society, it remained infected with heresy. Other victims may have survived the procedure, but were left crippled, unable to move or give birth, which for the society of that time was tantamount to social death. The inquisitors understood the power of humiliation. Public searches, when women were stripped naked in front of a crowd and searched for marks of the devil on their bodies, often escalated into collective violence. Witches became objects of sexual abuse under the guise of church ritual. Female genitalia were seen as a source of evil, and therefore a particular cruelty was directed there. There are known cases when genitals were burned with red-hot iron, leaving burns that the victim could not survive. The chronicles of 15th century Spain contain records of women whose vaginas were burned with coals before execution, on the grounds that fire drives out demons. It is important to understand the context. 14th, 16th century Europe was a time of panic. Plague epidemics, famine, wars, all of this demanded someone to blame. Women became the scapegoats, especially those who were single, educated, or who deviated from patriarchal norms. Suspicion of lesbian relationships was a convenient tool. Intimacy between women was interpreted not as a private matter, but as a challenge to the established order, undermining the natural purpose of women, to be mothers and serve men. Thus, sexual violence became an integral part of a punitive system, designed to show that any attempt to live differently would be punished not only with death, but also with humiliation. Medical treatises of the time only reinforced the legitimacy of torture. Doctors working in the courts claimed that lesbians had invisible demons living inside their bodies, which could only be expelled through the physical destruction of their organs. This meant that violence was perceived as treatment. Reports often contain expressions such as cleansing the womb or burning the root of lust. But behind these words lay procedures that caused women to die in inhuman agony. In some cases, A mixture of salt and vinegar was poured onto burned tissue, causing hours of agony. The social atmosphere intensified the fear. Crowds gathered to watch the trials. The female body, tortured in front of the public, became an instrument of intimidation. The victims were exposed naked, chained to benches, and any spectator could see what happened to those who dared to challenge the authority of the church. Female nudity turned into an element of punishment, both aroused and frightened the crowd. And this combination of horror and secret desire made torture even more attractive to the inquisitors, who justified their actions by referring to scripture. Cases of violence against sorceresses and lesbians were recorded not only in Spain and France. In the German lands, at the beginning of the 16th century, the method of hot wedges was widely used when a wooden object was preheated on coals and then inserted into the body. Executioners working in courts described this as separating the flesh to remove impurity. In reality, it was a sophisticated form of torture that led to charring of tissues and slow death. But official documents only noted that the witch confessed to her crimes. This practice was no secret. Papal bulls issued in the 13th and 15th centuries enshrined the Inquisition's right to use any means necessary to detect heresy. One of the letters from the Inquisitor Bernard Guy explicitly stated that it is necessary to test the female body so that it testifies against itself. Translated into human language, this meant that sexual torture was not only permitted, but desirable. A woman had to confess to what she was accused of, even if it required the destruction of her flesh. It is in these details that the true horror is revealed. The Inquisition did not simply kill. It turned death into a spectacle and humiliation, turning women's bodies into a field for the realization of sadistic fantasies under the guise of religious duty. Torture with wooden wedges, rape in monastery basements, burning of private parts. These were not random episodes, but systematic practices reflected in documents, witness statements, and verdicts. And behind the dry words, interrogation conducted, lay nights of pain, from which not a single woman's voice has survived, only the cold records of executioners and judges. In many European cities, court records have been preserved, each page a testimony to the horror. If you read them carefully, it becomes clear that the Inquisition created a system where torture was not an occasional excess, but a mandatory stage. Women suspected of witchcraft or sinful intimacy with each other were first subjected to public humiliation. They were stripped naked, searched in front of witnesses, and forced to endure the touch of so-called examiners who searched their bodies for marks of the devil, moles, scars, birthmarks. To the crowd, it looked like a ritual, but in reality, it was the first act of violence when the private became public. After that, the torture began. In 15th century Germany, the tub of shame was widely used. A woman was placed naked in a wooden barrel, and rats or snakes were released inside. Such methods were explained by the belief that the living must drive out the demonic. But the main abuse was directed at the intimate parts of the body. The Nuremberg trial records describe a case where the accused had an oak wedge inserted into her vagina, which was gradually widened with wooden hammers. Her body was torn apart, and blood flowed down the stone slabs. All this was accompanied by demands to confess to sexual intercourse with women and the devil. France also had similar practices. The Toulouse archives contain a description of the so-called cleansing procedure. A woman was tied to a wooden bench. A vessel with burning coals was placed between her legs, and brought closer until her skin began to char. Her screams were considered proof that the devil inside was resisting. Sometimes women lost consciousness, but they were revived with cold water, and the torture continued. It was important for the inquisitors not to kill too soon, but to force the accused to talk. Particular cruelty was shown towards those suspected of lesbian relationships. Patriarchal society could not tolerate the existence of female intimacy without a man. Such women were declared not only heretics, but also desecrators of nature. Therefore, the punishment had to be emphatically sexual in nature. The chronicles mention that they were raped by executioners or guards in the name of truth, and priests in the protocols called it testing carnal delusion. Humiliation became an official part of the procedure, enshrined in the words, "It is necessary to test the body." In Italy, especially in Rome and Florence, where the church sought to set public examples, torture was accompanied by mass executions. In the 15th century, in Campo dei Fiori Square, there was a well-known case when 3 women accused of having intercourse with each other and with the devil were tortured with wedges and then had their genitals burned with red-hot iron rods in public. The crowd watched, and many chroniclers of the time noted a strange mixture of horror and excitement among the male spectators. The woman's body became an arena of demonstrative cruelty, and her suffering became a public spectacle. Medical authorities of the time often witnessed the torture. Their task was to confirm the authenticity of the procedures. Doctors claimed that when exposed to fire or wedges, one could observe the exit of impurity. In reality, these were simply burns, blood, and torn tissue. But the official conclusions of doctors reinforced the public's belief that everything that was happening was science and not sadism. We find similar evidence in the treatise Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written at the end of the 15th century, which directly stated that women were prone to sex with the devil and therefore deserved the most severe punishment. Most often, after torture, a woman would sign a confession, not because she considered herself guilty, but because the pain was unbearable. The signed papers were kept in archives and used as evidence of the existence of witches and heresy. This created a vicious circle. New confessions led to new executions. Women died and the system was strengthened. But there were also those who refused to speak. The chronicles of the city of Cologne mention a woman named Gertrude, accused of living with another woman as with a husband. She was subjected to 3 procedures: wooden wedges, burning with coals, and violence from the prison guards. She died without signing a confession. Her body was still taken to the square and burned, declaring that even death did not make her renounce the devil. This documentary series shows that torture was not the random excesses of individual fanatics. It was a system that operated for decades, covering France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Switzerland. Women's bodies became instruments of intimidation, and public burnings became a theater of power, where the church and state showed that any deviation from the norm would not only be destroyed, but also publicly humiliated. The Hammer of Witches is a book that changed everything. Published at the end of the 15th century, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger's treatise was not just a collection of advice for inquisitors. It was a veritable textbook of sadism, with each page offering methods on how to properly break a woman accused of witchcraft or carnal sin with other women. The text of the Malleus Maleficarum itself openly stated that women were more prone to heresy than men, as they were weaker in mind but stronger in lust. From this, the conclusion was drawn that torture should be directed primarily at the sexual sphere of their lives. The inquisitors used this treatise as if it were a legal code. Its pages stated that lesbian intimacy is nothing less than a direct union with the devil, and therefore requires extermination by fire and iron. It also suggested subjecting women to internal testing, which meant using wedges, red-hot instruments, and public searches. This way, sadism became an official procedure backed by religious authority. The Church sought to ensure that any suspicious form of female intimacy became grounds for accusation. Denunciations multiplied. It was enough for a neighbor to say, "These two women live together and avoid men," and this became a reason for interrogation. In conditions of constant panic, it became profitable to inform on others. Denunciations protected the informers themselves from suspicion and often allowed them to take possession of the victim's property. In cities in Germany and France where the witch hunt reached its peak, hundreds of women were imprisoned simply because they were widows, lived together, or spent too much time without male company. Doctors and priests who were present during the torture played a special role. They were the ones who had to confirm the validity of the accusations. But in reality, their job was to perpetuate the myth of female lust as a source of heresy. Doctors claimed that women who had sex with other women had distorted uteruses, which could supposedly be detected during an examination. These examinations were carried out by force, in front of priests and executioners, and turned into a form of legalized rape. Interrogation records show that sexual torture was not a spontaneous act of cruelty by individuals. It was an official part of the investigation. One document from Münster explicitly states the suspect was subjected to internal testing by fire, after which she confessed to having relations with women and with a demon. These dry lines meant that the woman's genitals had been burned. The executioners acted according to instructions, and the priests recorded every word as evidence. The Inquisition knew that mass trials required mass confessions. Therefore, torture was always accompanied by the threat of public disgrace. Women were often brought out naked into the square, their bodies examined in front of a crowd, and anyone could point out the mark of the devil. These marks were everywhere: a mole on the thigh, a scar on the stomach, a spot on the chest. All of this became evidence of a connection with the devil. But the main confirmation always remained sinful sexuality. Priests and inquisitors understood that fear of shame was no less effective than pain. Therefore, the female body became an arena of double humiliation, physical and social. In addition, women accused of intimacy with each other were automatically considered witches, since union without the will of a man was impossible without the devil's intervention. Thus, sexuality became evidence, and any form of deviation from the norm became a death sentence. An important point: the Malleus Maleficarum prescribed consulting scientific authorities, doctors, anatomists, and monastic lecturers. This made torture legitimate and rational. To the crowd, the execution of a witch did not seem arbitrary. It appeared to be the logical conclusion of a trial. In reality, however, it was this very process that turned into a theater of violence, where the female body became a victim time and time again. Examples from Switzerland at the end of the 15th century show how deeply this logic had taken root. In Bern in 1488, a group of women were accused of having intercourse with each other and with the devil. They were inserted with wooden wedges, then their wounds were doused with boiling water until they confessed to heretical connections. Their execution was accompanied by a public reading of the Malleus Maleficarum to emphasize the legitimacy of what was happening. The crowd heard words about lust and sin and saw the women's bodies torn apart on the torture benches. Thus, religious treatises, denunciations by neighbors, and official medicine came together to form a single system. Sexual violence was legalized, becoming a form of sacred punishment. A woman suspected of intimacy with another woman was deprived not only of her life, she was deprived of the right to her own body, which the Church declared to be the property of God and an instrument of the devil at the same time. Historians still argue about how mass hysteria turned individual trials into chain reactions that destroyed entire villages. 16th and 17th century Germany and France were places where fear of heresy and female lust merged into a single stream. Hundreds of women were drawn into trials that began with a single denunciation. At first, suspicion fell on a neighbor who lived without a husband. Then her friend came under investigation, and within a few weeks, half of the female population of the local community was involved. A classic example was the Würzburg series of trials in the early 17th century. Over several years, hundreds of women were executed there, including girls under the age of 10. The indictments contain identical phrases: had intercourse with other women as with a husband, served the devil with her flesh. These words became a template, repeated without evidence. When a woman denied her guilt, she was subjected to torture with wedges, fire, and rape. Under torture, everyone confessed. The confession became evidence against a friend, neighbor, or relative, and the process snowballed. In France, such hysteria swept across entire provinces. In Artois, in the 1560s, accusations of lesbian relationships and witchcraft coincided with political conflicts and the wars of the Reformation. In the chaos, any woman who showed independence could find herself accused. The court records of Saint-Omer contain entries about a group of women who were declared a sisterhood of lust. They were tortured with wooden wedges and red-hot rods, then publicly burned in the square. The execution was accompanied by sermons proclaiming that women who reject men reject God. Mass hysteria always had an economic underpinning. The confiscated property of the victims went to the treasury of the church and local authorities. This made witch hunts profitable. The records often included not only confessions, but also lists of property, houses, land, livestock. After the execution, these resources were redistributed among informers and officials. Thus, sexual violence and the destruction of women also served material gain. In Germany at the end of the 16th century, the practice of denunciation reached absurd proportions. There is a well-known case in Bamberg when a whole group of nuns was accused of having intercourse with each other. They were tortured with wooden wedges and their genitals were burned. Some died under torture, others were executed in the square. The chronicler of those events notes, "The crowd watched as their bodies writhed, and many saw this as proof of the power of God." But behind the religious words lay simple cruelty, elevated to the norm. In France, the trials were accompanied by a special theatricality. In Lyon, in the early 17th century, women were brought out into the square, naked, chained to carts. Their bodies were covered with burns from previous torture, and the crowd knew in advance that these women served Satan with their flesh. Burning was only the finale. The real punishment was that they were turned into a spectacle where their pain was put on display. Accusations of female intimacy were particularly cruel because they were considered a direct challenge to patriarchal authority. Male power over women's bodies was an axiom. And if a woman chose a woman, it destroyed the very model of society. Therefore, punishments in such cases were characterized by exaggerated sexual cruelty. Wooden wedges, red-hot iron, gang rape by guards, all this was recorded in the protocols under the guise of purification. The psychological aspect of mass hysteria was no less frightening. In small villages, women began to suspect each other. Any display of friendship or intimacy became dangerous. Girls understood from childhood that if they spent too much time together, it could lead to accusations. The Inquisition instilled in people's minds the idea that female intimacy was a deal with the devil. This created an atmosphere of fear in which any female community was destroyed by denunciations and executions. The stories of individual victims in the archives show that mass hysteria spared no one. In 1628, a woman named Margaret was executed in Fulda, accused of secretly living with her neighbor as with a husband. Under torture, she was subjected to the burning of her genitals and rape by the guards. She signed a confession in which she named her friend. A month later, both were burned at the stake. These events show that witch hunts were not only a religious, but also a social mechanism. They destroyed women's bonds, subjected women's bodies to male control, and turned violence into a ritual. Mass hysteria in Germany and France made sexual torture part of public life. The crowd got used to the idea that women's bodies were a place for punishment and that pain was proof of guilt. The Spanish Inquisition, founded at the end of the 15th century by Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, became a model of centralized terror. Unlike many local courts in Germany or France, where trials often took the form of regional outbreaks, Spain turned the hunt for witches and heretics into a well-organized system. A special role was played here by the fact that the Catholic monarchy saw the Inquisition as an instrument of unity. Religion and power were to merge into one. In this context, women accused of witchcraft and sinful intimacy were regarded not only as heretics, but also as a threat to the very order of society. The archives of the Inquisition in Toledo and Zaragoza contain dozens of protocols describing torture using wooden wedges, burning of genitals, and humiliating medical examinations. These documents are striking in their dry wording. For example, the suspect confessed to the crime after being tested with an internal wedge and subsequent cauterization. Behind these lines lie hours of pain that the woman endured in the dungeon, tied to a stone bench with a red-hot iron between her legs. Spain went further than other countries in the theatricalization of punishment. Auto da fe, solemn public executions, became real spectacles. Women accused of lesbian relationships or intercourse with the devil were brought to the square in special ritual clothing. Their bodies were often already mutilated by torture, burns on the skin, lacerations from wooden wedges, traces of violence from the guards. The crowd saw not just an execution, but the result of divine judgment. And this was the psychological power of the Inquisition. It is noteworthy that the Spanish system punished not only women from the lower classes, There are known cases when nuns became victims. In monasteries, sisterhoods of lust were suspected, and the inquisitors interpreted close friendship or physical intimacy between nuns as a connection with the devil. The protocols mention that such women were subjected to purification by iron. Their genitals were burned with coals, after which they had to confess. Such cases were recorded with particular care because they destroyed the reputation of monasteries and showed that no one was safe from suspicion. Confessors played an important role. During confession, women sometimes confessed to doubts of the flesh, which translated as either masturbation or intimacy with another woman. These confessions were passed on to the inquisitors. In this way, the system of religious control itself became a mechanism for denunciation. A woman could be brought to trial, not by her enemies, but by her own confessor. Torture in Spain was accompanied by a special focus on humiliation. A woman's naked body was seen as a field for experimentation. She was tied up, hoisted onto a rack, and then wedges were inserted, sometimes pre-soaked in resin or vinegar. When the tissue tore, salt was sprinkled on it to increase the pain. The doctors who were there wrote down, "The patient confessed after 3 trials." The word patient in these notes sounds especially cruel. The woman was turned into an object of treatment, even though it was really systematic destruction. Cases involving women accused of refusing to marry or bear children were particularly cruel. For Spanish society at that time, the role of women was reduced to motherhood. Refusal to marry was perceived as a challenge to the established order. If a woman had a close relationship with another woman, this became proof of a connection with the devil. Torture of the genitals in such cases was interpreted as restoring the natural order. Records show that in Seville in the 1580s, a group of women were subjected to purification by fire. Red-hot metal discs were placed on their perineums, and when their skin began to melt, they were forced to confess. Several women died on the spot, while others signed whatever was put in front of them. These confessions were read out in the square before they were burned, so that the crowd could hear the truth from the victims' own mouths. Unlike many other regions, the Spanish Inquisition carefully recorded all proceedings. That is why today we know not only about the executions, but also about the methods of torture themselves. These records are devoid of emotion, but that is precisely what makes them so horrific. They demonstrate that violence was bureaucratized. Women did not simply suffer. Their suffering became part of a reporting system that was integrated into the state apparatus. As a result, it was Spain that turned sexual violence against accused women into a ritual where sadism was not a deviation, but the norm. Women's bodies were burned, broken, and humiliated, not for the sake of random cruelty, but to show that no form of female autonomy, neither spiritual nor sexual, was acceptable in a society where the power of God and the crown merged into one. Daily life in 16th and 17th century Europe was gradually permeated by an atmosphere of terror that shaped new cultural norms. The female body ceased to be perceived as private and inviolable. It became an arena for public experiments, proof of guilt, an object of religious inspection and humiliation. Hundreds of public executions, thousands of tortures, tens of thousands of denunciations created a psychological background in which women lived under constant threat of exposure. In cities and villages, women began to fear any displays of intimacy with each other. Friendship, living together, even simple attention could arouse suspicion. If a neighbor often visited another woman, it became a reason for rumors. The culture of denunciation turned intimate life into a zone of constant risk. As a result, female solidarity was destroyed, and social ties between women were eroded. What had previously been part of everyday life, working together, helping with childbirth, raising children together, could now be interpreted as sisterhood of lust. Men, on the other hand, became accustomed to the spectacle of pain. Mass autodafé and executions made torture part of the public sphere. Crowds gathered not only for the sentence, but also for the humiliation. Naked women chained to posts, bodies mutilated by wedges or fire, became a familiar sight. This ritual reinforced the patriarchal order. Men watched as the power of the church and the state emphasized that women's bodies did not belong to them, but to the system. As a result, the idea took root in the mass consciousness that women who violated the norm should not simply be punished, but publicly destroyed. Religious culture actively supported this process. Sermons spoke of the weakness of female flesh and the need to curb lust. The word woman was increasingly associated with danger. Priests believed that through women, heresy, demons, and disease entered the world. This was also reflected in art. In Baroque painting, witches were depicted naked, surrounded by flames and demons. Their bodies served as a visual metaphor for sin and debauchery. This image became entrenched in the public imagination and was reproduced by generations. The psychological effect was devastating. Women learned to fear their own bodies. Any deviation, an unusual mole, excessively long periods, infertility, became a cause for suspicion. As a result, many hid their illnesses or tried to seek treatment in secret. Traditional women's medicine, passed down through generations of herbalists and midwives, was destroyed. Those who knew about herbs or knew how to ease the pain of childbirth were often accused of witchcraft and tortured. The witch hunt also changed attitudes towards sexuality. Female sexuality was no longer perceived as a natural part of life. It was associated with sin, danger, and the threat of devilish interference. This was especially true of any form of female intimacy. What had previously been able to exist secretly or in private now became deadly dangerous. Society developed a reflex. A woman who was not connected to a man was suspicious. This reflex would live on in culture for centuries to come. The legacy of witch hunts lingered even after the fires had been extinguished. By the 18th century, when the Enlightenment brought new ideas about freedom and reason, traces of this fear still remained in Europe. Women continued to face accusations of corruption or abnormal intimacy. Medical treatises continued to describe female sexuality as dangerous and unreliable for a long time. Even when public executions became a thing of the past, the stereotypes created by the Inquisition continued to exist in culture. Female intimacy was seen not as a personal choice, but as a threat to society. For men, this era cemented the habit of seeing the female body as an object of external control. Public torture and executions instilled the idea that women's suffering was part of the social order. This cruel norm left a deep mark. In the 17th and 18th centuries, domestic violence against women was perceived as natural. Historians rightly note that without the mass witch trials, it is impossible to explain the scale of patriarchal violence in subsequent centuries. Thus, the cultural legacy of witch hunts and executions of lesbians was not limited to thousands of deaths. It changed the very fabric of society. The female body became a symbol of danger, female intimacy a symbol of sin, and public violence an instrument of power. Even after the Inquisition ceased to exist, its traces continued to live on in the European consciousness, shaping attitudes toward women until the 19th century and beyond. Today, centuries after the fires of the Inquisition were extinguished, we are faced with another form of violence, the violence of oblivion. The history of the torture of witches and women accused of intimacy with each other has come down to us in fragments. Most of the documents were destroyed or deliberately rewritten. Church and court archives have preserved dry protocols, confessions, names, lists of property, but the voices of the victims have disappeared. We know their cries only through the words of executioners and inquisitors. The suspect confessed. The suspect did not resist. Behind these words lie hours of pain that no one has described directly. This silence is no accident. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe sought to erase the memory of its own atrocities. In official histories, the witch hunt was presented as a delusion of the Dark Ages. Many chronicles mentioned only general facts, the number of people executed, the names of the inquisitors. But sexual violence, wedges, burning of private parts, humiliation, all this was erased. Even in modern textbooks on the history of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, this topic is often hidden behind neutral words, interrogation with bias, corporal punishment, religious fanaticism. However, where the original protocols remain, we can see how cruel these practices were. And that is why many researchers call the witch hunt one of the greatest gender genocides in history. Thousands of women were destroyed not only as heretics, but also as those who did not fit into the patriarchal norm. Any form of female autonomy, especially sexual autonomy, was subject to eradication. In this sense, witch hunts were not only a religious phenomenon, but also a social project aimed at consolidating male power over women's bodies. In the 20th century, this topic returned thanks to feminist historiography. Researchers began to argue that the destruction of lesbians and women accused of being intimate with each other was part of systemic violence. They pointed out that women's bodies were tortured precisely because they were considered dangerous, uncontrollable, and excessively sensual. And although historical science remains cautious in its assessments, today we know that torture with wedges, burning of genitals, and public rape were reality, not fiction. But the memory of the victims is still fragmentary. Their names have been preserved only in the records of the charges. We know Margaret of Fulda, Gertrude of Cologne, anonymous women from Würzburg, Toulouse, and Seville. But behind each of them are hundreds of nameless women whose fates were lost in the ashes of the fires. They left no descendants because their bodies were destroyed and their memory was erased. Contemporary society rarely considers that the familiar attitude toward female sexuality as something suspicious, dangerous, or subject to control has its roots in that very era. The legacy of the Inquisition lives on in language, culture, and stereotypes. It manifests itself in the fact that female autonomy still provokes resistance, and women who choose women face violence and prejudice. That is why it is important not only to know the facts, but also to restore memory. Behind every dry record of the suspect confessed after trial lies a life with a childhood, love, hopes. These lives were destroyed not because women were actually witches or heretics, but because their existence did not fit into the rules of society. And because the church and the state use their bodies as an instrument of fear, historical essays like memory should not be burned at the stake. It is important to understand that the Inquisition did not just kill. It shaped a cultural heritage that influenced the perception of women for centuries. And if today we talk about equality, freedom, and rights, we must remember the price that was paid for this knowledge. The women who were broken with wedges and burned with fire are part of our shared history. They cannot be erased, as they have been for centuries. They must be named, remembered, and recognized